It was one of those evenings when the light in the city softened into a warm blur, and the street lamps threw orange puddles across the glass of the restaurant windows. The air carried the mingled perfume of lemon oil and warm bread, and the distant siren of a late bus. And inside, a table for two had been settled like a small promise. Cloth folded, candles waiting, a watchful silence around the place setting. Daniel Harper smoothed his napkin with fingers that trembled just enough to betray him, glancing at his watch as if the hands could answer questions. He had turned punctuality into armor and into habit, and the waiting felt like a question he had asked too many times before. A clock on the far wall ticked as if to measure his patience against some old ledger of disappointments. He was ready to stand when a small interruption arrived, the kind of interruption that cracks formality into something living. A little girl in a yellow raincoat came running across the polished floor, her sneakers whispering against the tiles, a stuffed rabbit clutched under one arm, cheeks freckled and serious. Her hands were the size of a promise, and she wrapped them around Daniel's pant leg like an anchor. Her voice was a small trumpet that carried the weight of conviction. "My mommy is late," she said, and she said it without the flutter of apology adults practiced. Daniel's annoyance folded in on itself the way paper creases, replaced by an odd, sudden tenderness that tasted of metal and mint. He looked toward the door before he looked at the woman who arrived, but the woman who entered was not the careful, rehearsed apology he had expected. Nora Ruiz arrived, with her hair in a loose knot, a small scrape of dust on her sleeve, and a voice that started with apology and ended with the kind of confession that can change how a person is seen. "I stopped because a man had fallen on the sidewalk," she said simply, as if the sentence were ordinary and easy to hold. For Daniel, the admission opened something older than his irritation. It touched the place where late nights and empty chairs had taught him to assume he would always be the one to count minutes and pick up pieces. He felt the memory of a mother who had let minutes pass without returning, a small boy on a threshold with a malfunctioning clock and no one on the other side. That cooling ache moved under his ribs like a small animal. He listened as Nora explained that she had helped the man to sit up, that she had given him her scarf until the ambulance came, and that the reason she had been late was not neglect but an unplanned decision to do what felt right. The waiter, Tomas, a lean man with a careful smile, placed a glass of water in front of Daniel and offered a small disarming joke about business plans and apologies. He told them the house special was a lemon roast that smelled like a memory of mornings, and the restaurant owner, Mrs. Alvarez, popped her head out from the kitchen to ask if they wanted bread with the meal. The room hummed with soft jazz and the clinking of silverware and the domestic music of a place that had seen 100 beginnings. They began with the formalities that ground awkward people into conversation. Daniel introduced himself as if he were reading from a script he had practiced for awkward dinners, and Nora laughed when he mispronounced a name on his phone. The little girl, Maya, sat on a booster chair and watched them as if she were making a ledger of adults. The first exchanges were small and polite, and then, as the plates arrived steaming, the conversation loosened into something warmer. Nora spoke about her volunteer shifts at the community health clinic and how she always kept a spare bottle of water and Band-Aids in her tote. Daniel spoke about his job at a municipal planning office where he tried to make bus stops less lonely and more useful. They traded stories about the cafes they loved, about the row of bookstores near the square, and the bakery that saved bread for late evening patrons. Each anecdote slid into the next with the weight of things not yet decided but already easing. Dialogue between them lengthened into a deeper dance. Daniel asked about how Nora chose the clinic. She answered, saying she had always been a person who noticed small injuries and odd quiet faces. That admission made Daniel lean forward. "Did you ever think it would become part of who you are?" he asked. "Sometimes," she said, "a hand reaches out and you realize your hands know how to help." "Were you scared last night," she asked, "when you thought the date might leave?" "A little," he said. "No, more than a little," she said back, and they both laughed with the kind of relief that is nearly devotion. At one point, the bread bowl arrived, and Nora, without thinking, offered Daniel a napkin because his sleeve had a faint smear of sauce. His fingers brushed hers, and for a second both felt the small electricity of two people who had, earlier in life, accepted being overlooked. The waiter Tomas asked if they wanted coffee to finish. Yes, please, they said in unison, and the sound of it was a tiny agreement. Ben, the barista from the small cafe across the street, came by later dressed in his jacket and waved, because he had spotted Nora earlier and had come in to say hello and tip his hat to the couple who saved a stranger. The scene, fragrant and bright with steam and low light, folded them into a beginning that felt plausible and tender. A noticeable moment arrived when Nora handed Daniel a small linen handkerchief that she pulled from her pocket because he had flung his arm and knocked a glass. It was a simple square of linen with a faint embroidered boat, soft from years of washing and maybe from someone's memory. Daniel took it awkwardly. "Thank you," he said, and watched the way Nora's eyes softened. The handkerchief would later become more than a cloth. For now it was a gesture, gentle and without ceremony. There was laughter and a moment when Maya demanded to know why grown-ups said sorry when they spilled soup and then declared that apologies should be traded for cookies. Claire Jensen, who ran the corner library, nodded approvingly from a nearby table and offered a story about children who kept track of grown-up mistakes like a collection. The texture of the conversation was small kindnesses handmade into a scaffold. If you felt your chest tighten when the little girl interrupted their plans, you are not alone. Small acts reach places we barely know we have. Tell us in the comments what small act of kindness you saw recently. Start your reply with "I saw" so others can find your story easily. Sharing your moment can remind someone that small choices matter more than they seem. Read a few stories here and you may find a courage to knock on a neighbor's door, to give your seat on the bus, to hand someone a napkin without waiting for a reason. Now we go back to Daniel and Nora and see how the small choices they made together would come to rub against a larger, louder world. After that evening, they moved into a slow montage of meetings that looked ordinary and felt like stitches. They shared breakfasts that tasted of toasted seeds, worked on community planning meetings where Daniel introduced a new timeline for safer crosswalks, and Nora volunteered at the clinic on Wednesdays. They walked Maya to school when her mother, Leela, had late shifts at the bakery. And they traded books at the little library where Claire kept a handwritten catalog. They stopped for coffee at Ben's shop, where he learned Nora's order was a double espresso with oat milk, and Daniel liked a slow Americano. Mrs. Alvarez surprised them with a dessert that was never on the menu, called simply kindness cake, with a caramelized top and a note that said, "Keep showing up." Sam Ortiz from Daniel's office came once to a weekend street clean and took photos for a neighborhood newsletter. Olivia Green from the grocery store donated extra bags of dried beans to the clinic after Nora mentioned the need. The neighborhood folded around them like a familiar jacket. Embedded in these days were stories that explained who each of them was and why some things were tender places to touch. Daniel had grown up in an apartment above a laundromat where clocks were often wrong and schedules bent around other people's needs. As a child, he learned to watch doorways and to count the people who left, and that practice hardened into the belief that not being left was equal parts luck and permission. He studied urban planning because he wanted fewer people to feel stranded, and he took comfort in maps and timetables that made the city legible. His father had been quiet about feelings and louder about plans, and when his father left one winter without much explanation, Daniel learned to tighten his belt against the possible hollowness of waiting. Nora grew up in a house where meals were always an invitation, and where scraping together enough was an art practiced with grace. She trained as a nurse practitioner because she could not walk past a bruised knee without pausing. The memory of helping a neighbor with a fever at age 9 sat alongside the practical training of stitches and triage, shaping a person who put a hand out without announcing it. Maya had come into Nora's life as a close friend to Nora's sister Leela's child, a bright armful of questions who had a surprising capacity for honesty. Each of their histories explained small reflexes and bigger fears. There were moments of tension that altered the landscape of the romance into unsteady ground. The first came when a local neighborhood blog wrote a piece about the man Nora had helped that night and included a photo that misidentified Daniel as the person who had ignored the situation. The blog quoted a commenter who suggested that some people were more interested in appearances than in action and used the photo to stitch a story about privilege. The post spread faster than expected. Mr. Patel, a local reporter, called with a tone that suggested he had already decided the angle. He asked questions that sounded like accusations. "Why did you wait at that table while she helped the man?" he asked. Daniel tried to explain that he had been there testing his own patience and that assumptions were dangerous. The comments mounted into the hundreds, and Rosa Nguyen, who edited the neighborhood magazine, sent an internal note asking for more verification. The heat of public scrutiny pressed on their small, happy routine like a hand. People they had known politely at the farmer's market began to offer cold shoulders. Claire, the librarian, refused to carry their newsletter for 2 weeks until the storm cooled. This public friction made them both defensive in private and uncertain about how to appear in public. The second moment of tension arrived with a very ordinary accident that suddenly felt intimate. At a community picnic, a child spilled a bowl of punch and someone reached for napkins. Nora grabbed the linen handkerchief from her bag and folded it with quick, practiced hands to blot a stain from a volunteer's sleeve. A friend named David Hugh misread that motion and told a local gossip that Nora had been too familiar with the wrong company. The rumor seeped into a gossip column with a headline that exaggerated and a tone that invited judgment. The handkerchief, which had seemed like a small marker of tenderness, now read like something scandalous to some. Daniel found himself angry in a way that did not fit the woman he liked, telling stories with clipped sentences in front of friends and forgetting that Nora had never asked for protection. The misinterpretation gnawed at the small trust they had built. The third moment of tension moved into sharp private rupture. A video taken at the clinic where Nora volunteered went viral with commentary that suggested she was seeking attention. The clip was short and uncontextualized. Mr. Patel called again and asked if Nora would do a short interview to clarify what happened that night. She said no at first because publicity felt like a glare she did not want to step into. Daniel thought silence would look like cowardice. They argued, not loudly, but in that grinding way that wears tenderness thin. Words like "you should" and "you always" do not land well when thrown across a kitchen table. In front of Maya, the edges of their disagreement were visible, and the child retreated to the corner of the room with her rabbit. The argument ended with Nora walking out and the door closing with a soft, final click that sounded like a verdict. The neighborhood hummed with speculation. People took sides in small conversations beside stacks of apples and in waiting rooms. When they were at the lowest point, Daniel left a voice message that said, "I am sorry," in a tone that had not been in his voice before. Nora did not answer for days. The silence spread into texts left unread, and invitations to community events declined. Daniel sat on a park bench and watched the bus that he had helped design stop and go and stop again. And in the pause, he thought about the ways he had misunderstood courage. The rupture was a sharp thing that made both of them question whether small, meaningful acts were enough when the public made them into theater. He decided to come back with the most human of gestures. Early one rainy morning, he walked 3 blocks to Nora's apartment carrying bags of groceries and a small paper-wrapped bundle. The groceries were not grand groceries. They were the kinds of things that said, "I see the practical parts of your life." Canned tomatoes, rice, fresh cilantro, a small bar of dark chocolate that Nora liked. The wrapped bundle was the linen handkerchief he had kept folded in his jacket since that first spill. He had laundered it in a sink and smoothed it on the radiator and imagined that returning it would be a way of returning everything that had been shared. Maya let him in and held his hand for a moment before releasing it with a trust that felt like room to breathe. He found Nora at the kitchen table, eyes reddened, head bowed over a stack of forms for the clinic, and when she looked up, the sight of him standing there with the grocery bags and the handkerchief made her face change into something that had been hard to find in the last weeks. Their reconnection scene unfolded with slow, careful dialogue that matched the rhythm of grocery bags being put on the counter. Daniel set the bags down. "I brought too much," he said with a small, rueful smile. "You always bring too much," Nora said, and that made them both smile in the old way. "I kept this," he said, and he handed her the handkerchief. "You did," she said, as if the object had been both lost and found. "Why did you leave it?" he asked. "Because I thought I would hold on to the memory," she said. "That is a bad reason to hold on to things," he said. "Maybe it is," she replied, "but memories help me know how to act." They talked about the articles and the comments and the way the neighborhood had sharpened into sides. "Did you see what they wrote?" he asked. "I saw," she said. "Were you afraid?" he asked softly. "Afraid of being defined by what a clip could show," she answered. "Then forgive me for being foolish in public," he said. "No," she said, "you were human." They both laughed in a small, honest burst. Maya asked for cookies, and Daniel promised they were in the bag. The handkerchief was folded and placed on a shelf above a jar of spoons, as if it were now both an ordinary thing and a symbol of return. A child returned to an act can be a great reconciler. Maya declared that people who are nice should get stickers and ran out to collect them from neighbors. The community noticed the small, consistent work of Nora at the clinic, and Ben the barista wrote a note to the neighborhood newsletter about the people who keep giving time without asking for notice. Mr. Patel, whose temper had initially responded to clicks and not context, published a column that asked for more careful reporting after a correction was warranted. Rosa Nguyen decided to run a longer piece with context and interviews, and she interviewed Claire and Mrs. Alvarez and even David Hugh, who publicly apologized for repeating rumor. The public noise did not entirely settle, but it softened, and the relationships that mattered returned to their previous textures. The handkerchief became a small joke and also a quiet testament to the fact that a returned object can be a bridge. 1 month later, they had a community dinner at the library, where Claire arranged seating and the kids made paper lanterns. The library posted a sign that read "Meals and Stories" because some dinners could be reconnections. Daniel and Nora sat next to each other and shared a plate. They were still learning the language of repair, but had become fluent enough to know how to fold an apology into a shared task. The little handkerchief lay in Nora's bag like a talisman. They spoke to neighbors about a new crosswalk plan, and Nora signed up for a first aid workshop with other volunteers. 3 months later, Maya had her birthday party in the park, and Daniel had helped design the layout so that parents could sit and talk while kids ran. He brought a stack of books he loved, and Nora baked a tray of small lemon squares that tasted like the first dinner they shared. They had a quiet moment when the sun eased and someone played a simple tune on a guitar. A local reporter arrived to cover the community gardens and asked about the couple who had been on the news. They both laughed at the memory and answered with the kind of modesty that keeps attention away from performance. Their names appeared in a piece that was careful and kind. 6 months later, a small plaque was placed in the community library by Claire acknowledging donors and volunteers. It read in language that chose tenderness over spectacle, "For those who show up and for those who stay." Daniel and Nora took a photo together in front of the plaque with Maya holding Mr. Buttons the rabbit high like a flag. They had not unfolded into a perfect story, but into a family of chosen actions. Daniel had learned to wait less as a defensive posture and more as an invitation to be present. Nora had learned that her instinct to act could create ripples beyond one night, and that explanations might be necessary, but that they did not diminish the rightness of helping. The linen handkerchief was framed in a small shadow box in the library with a note about kindness kept alongside it. Mrs. Alvarez baked a small celebratory tart, and Ben from the coffee shop set up a pop-up stand that donated proceeds to the clinic. Their final conversation in the epilogue was quiet and ordinary and held the weight of everything that had happened. On a bench near the square where children drew chalk pictures on hot pavement, Daniel reached for Nora's hand, not because of urgency, but because the gesture had become his language. "I do not know what the future will be," he said. "Me neither," she answered, "but I know I want you at my table more than I want to be right." They both laughed, and the sound was the kind of thing that feels like settling into home. He asked, without a flourish and without dramatics, "Would you try staying on purpose?" She considered this as someone who had always acted on impulse and also on principle. "Yes," she said, and the quiet agreement was enough. The little rabbit Mr. Button sat on Maya's lap, and the sun slid between buildings like a ribbon. If the world turned noisy again, they had learned how to keep a small domestic kindness between them, a thing stronger than headlines. If this story touched you, please consider subscribing to more narratives about everyday courage and kindness. If you felt moved by one small gesture, tell us about it in the comments, beginning with "I saw," so others can find your moment easily. Your story might remind someone to stop and help a person on a bench or to hand an umbrella to a stranger. This community is built on small acts that add up, and your voice matters. Share this video with someone who needs a gentle reminder that kindness does not always look heroic. It often looks ordinary, and it often stays. They learned that love was not a single declaration, but a sequence of small returns. The romance between Daniel and Nora did not begin with fireworks or fireworks-like endings. It unfolded in napkins offered without calculation, in groceries carried for no audience, and in time given without ledger. Maya taught them how direct honesty can clear fog, and how a child can name a truth adults dance around. The neighborhood chose to be kinder in ways small and noticeable. A few people still clicked for spectacle, but most noticed that a returned handkerchief could be a tidy emblem of something older than both of them. The final image stayed with people who passed the library and read the plaque, a quiet reminder that family can be chosen and cultivated like a garden. Because sometimes life rearranges the plans you write on paper and replaces them with the people who show up for you again and again. If this story warmed you, share it, subscribe for more, and remember to look for the small chances to be kind that wait on ordinary sidewalks every day.